Okay, hello everyone. We have already discussed our first two chapters of NCERT 11th class. ठीक है, तो we have already discussed के what were the things before the independence, right? We went for the historical perspective of the Indian economy. ठीक है, before independence, how was the Indian economy, and after independence from 1950s, right, 1950s to 1990, right? What was the condition of Indian economy, how Indian economy progressed, right? In the last chapter, that is chapter 2 of our NCERT. So we saw what were the policy changes that were done by the government of India, right? तो government of India ने कैसे agriculture को strengthen किया, right? We saw many of the reforms that came up in the agriculture sector, like green revolution and land reforms, etc. And then we also focused on industry and industrial policy, right? Industrial policy of 1956, and then we also went for the trade policies, right? So we saw how the composition of India's agriculture and industry and other the population that was engaged in these activities, how it went for the transformation from 1950s to 1990, right? तो ये सब चीजें हमने देखी, right? And today what we are going to start is after 1991, how was the Indian economy? What was the progress of Indian economy, right? We will be discussing about this, and from 1991, what actually happened in Indian economy? We went for the reforms, right? LPG reforms, what they are called, that is liberalization, privatization, and globalization reforms, right? तो हम 1991 के बाद की बात देखते हैं अब, how the Indian economy progressed from here, right? Okay. So this quote is very important by our former president of India, K.R. Narayan, and he was saying that the world knows that economic development that is measured in the form of GDP is not the measure of the progress of the society. So we need a different metric to measure the progress of a society, right? We should not be dependent only on the economic indicators. We should be focusing on other development indicators which will be giving the clear picture of the society's progress, right? Right. So this is very important quote. You can always mention in your essays, your even GS3 answers, right? Okay. Now moving to this chapter, we already know that the Indian economy after this 1950s till 1990s, there were significant reforms, but those reforms were problematic in some sense. Like rules and regulations were made, but they were more of controlling nature, right? Controlling and regulating in nature, right? So they were regulating the industries, and it was regulating them tightly, right? So instead of increasing the GDP or increasing the growth of the economy, they ended up decreasing its growth, right? They ended up in controlling it, right? So what actually has happened in 1991, we went for a crisis situation, right? The government was not able to meet its imports, right? So our exports were already not performing well, but we were not able to import those commodities that were essential from outside, right? So we were only able to have the funds for only 14 days of foreign exchange reserves, right? So this was a drop in the foreign exchange, right? So in that sense, we were about to become the indebted, right? So because of the rising of the prices, because of this rise, prices of the essential commodities started to rise, right? So why this all those things that we have discussed, why this problem has arisen, right, at the very first place? So we will be discussing about this. So about this, let me tell you about this PDF. That PDF and notes of this NCERT chapter you will be able to find in the course. Like उसकी description में link दे दी जाएगी, ठीक है? Description में link होगी, and then you can download it from there. Now, what is the background? Why these all problems started to come up? Why those problems came at the very first place? So financial crisis was because of the inefficient management by the government of the Indian economy. Right. What was the policies? The government was generating the funds, but the funds, that is revenues of the government, were very low. right? Taxation, the public sector enterprises, those were running, but public sector enterprises, as we have already discussed in chapter 2, those PSUs were running in losses, right? So government has to fund those also. And our taxation was not very well streamed, right? तो taxation से भी पैसे कम आते थे, right? Revenue was very low from the taxation. So what actually has happened was the government was expending more as spending more as compared to its earning, right? So government has to incur the deficit every year, right? And those deficit has to be financed from somewhere, and then financial institutions, it went to financial institutions to get the loans out of it, right? So our expenses were being funded by the loans that we were taking, right? And we all know that when we take the loans, we have to pay the money back as well as the interest also, right? So revenues were very low, and then government had to overshoot its revenue to meet the challenges, right? So government's revenue was low, right? So in that sense, employment, poverty, population explosion, what are the challenges before the government of the day, right? So government को unemployment, poverty को reduce करने के लिए भी पैसे खर्च करने पड़ते हैं. They have to spend it, right, on the welfare schemes and job creation schemes, skill development schemes, etc. But वो पैसे कहाँ से आएंगे जब when the revenue stream of the government is already very low. So government used to take the loans from outside, right? And then it used to fund its own expenses. But when the revenues were not growing, so those loans were not being serviced properly, right? Now, income from PSUs was not very high, and it was not able to meet the growing expenditure. So our foreign exchange reserves, whatever the reserves were there, they went to very low, right? Those foreign exchange were to be borrowed from elsewhere, right? From outside, right? In the financial institutions, by the financial institutions, we need to spend meeting for the consumption. Even for the consumption, we were taking the loans, as we have already discussed, right? So but what actually was happening, that no attempt was made in order to reduce those spending by the government, which could have been spent, right? So government was spending much as compared to it was earning, right? So no attempt was made to reduce those extra spendings, right? And not only was this, and also the exports were also not encouraged, right? So by the government of that time. So that is what led to the foreign exchange crisis. By 1980s, the prices of essential goods were very high, and imports were at very high rate, right? So imports were very high and essential goods prices were very high. So but what actually is needed is, when we want to import some commodities, we have to pay them, right? And then when we are not able to pay, right, we will be paying from foreign exchange reserves, but our foreign exchange reserves were already at very low, right? So in that sense, we were not able to import the things, right? And even if we were going for taking the loans from outside India, those international institutions were not able to not were not willing to give the loans to India. Why? Because we were already low in on our budget, right? So that is why India had to move to the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which is also called as World Bank, as well as IMF, International Monetary Fund, IMF. So what government did is that it borrowed a fund of $7 billion from there, right? But what actually was happening is, when someone gives you loan, he or she or even the financial institution may put some limits on you, right? So that limits were also had to be followed by the government of India. So what were those limits and what were those conditions? That those economy needs to be liberalized and opened for the world, right? So restrictions on the imports and exports has to be reduced by the government of India. And government said, okay, we will reduce our whatever the conditions, restrictions that we have already put, and we will be opening our economy, right? So this opening of economy is called as the LPG reforms. So India, what actually has happened is that Indian government brought new economic policy in 1991, and these were the basic foundational economic reforms that were put in place by the government of that time, right? So a more competitive environment was put in an economy, and barriers to the entry and exit of the firms and even the uh, exports and imports were reduced, right? So those those measures that Indian government took were can be divided into two parts, and this is very important. You should note these dams down, right? So those two groups are stabilization measures and structural measures, right? So we have to stabilize the economy and we have to reform the economy so that it can perform better in the long run, right? So stabilization measures क्या थे? Stabilization measures are very short term measures because prices were already very high at that point of the time, and our foreign exchange reserves were low. So what we did, we took that money and we tried to normalize the prices at that point of the time, right? So those were called as stabilization measures, and those measures were short term measures, and weakness like prices increase was tackled by those measures. ठीक है? Balance of payment crisis were prevented, and then inflation was made under control. And this was the stabilization measures. And another fund, some part of that fund was put into the structural reform measures. And what were the reforms that were taken up? Like efficiency of economy was improved. Then international competitiveness was improved, and rigidities in various segments of Indian economy was reduced. So what we are talking about in this by these lines we will be telling you one by one, and these reforms were called, as we have already discussed, that LPG reforms. So that is liberalization, privatization, and globalization reforms, right? LPG reforms. So what is meaning of liberalization, what is the meaning of privatization, and what is the meaning of globalization? Then we will be now considering about, right? So liberalization, what is this liberalization? Liberalize means to make someone free, right? So industrial licensing, like Indian economy was liberalized, right? So whatever the licensing procedures were there, Spectre Rise was there, and those industrial licensing of and export import policy, technology upgradation, fiscal policy, and foreign investments, etc. Though in those areas liberalization was performed, right? So how all those things were done? We know that the industrial sector was very highly controlled by the Indian government, right? And we have to take the licenses for every thing, right? So licenses were required for launching or misinvest from for setting up new industry, as well as expanding the already one, right? So those licenses were required. So in that sense, deregulation of industrial sector was done by the government of India. That was the first very important policy, and industrial licenses under the entrepreneur had to get permission from the government officer to start a firm, right? And then private sector was not allowed in many industries, and some goods could be produced only in small scale industries. So these were the issues with the industrial sector at that point of the time. So what was the issues? Industrial licensing was there, right? Private sector was not allowed in some sectors that we have already discussed, that those industries were categorized into three categories, right? So that we have already discussed in chapter 2, right? And then some goods were restricted for the small scale industry only, and control on the price fixation, and distribution of selected industrial products. The price was also being fixed by the government of India at that point of the time. So these were some of the challenges, some of these regulations that were put in place, right? Now what liberalization reform did to the Indian economy? Liberalization of reforms were taken up, industrial licensing was abolished for almost all products. So those licensing procedures were abolished for all products, right? Except alcohol, cigarettes, hazardous chemicals, industrial explosives, electronics, etc. Some of those problematic things, right? Maybe air sprays, drugs, and pharmaceuticals. Those were very sensitive sectors. For those, licenses were put. Otherwise, all other sectors were deregularized. ठीक है? Now, only some reserved areas for the public sector were reduced, right? And only the atomic energy and some core activities of railway transportation, etc., those were kept reserved for the public sector. Otherwise everything, every other sector was open for the public private sector, right? So public sector was regulated in that sense. Now many small scale industries, those things were reserved, were de-reserved, right? So in that sense that those small scale industries which were not reforming because of the reservation policy, they had to reform, or either they have to reform or they have to perish. ठीक है, तो ये एक चीज थी, ये एक रिफॉर्म था जो कि जिसे कि लिबरलाइजेशन रिफॉर्म्स कहते हैं, राइट? Those reforms of liberalization were related to the industry sector, and now we are coming to the financial sector reforms. How the financial sectors were liberalized, right? So institutions like commercial banks, investment banks, and stock exchange operations and foreign exchange market, everything was liberalized by the Indian government. ठीक है, those sectors, financial sectors, were mainly regulated by the Reserve Bank of India. But now, what actually was happening, that RBI's role was reduced, right? And some of the foreign banks, right, were allowed to come to India, right? Now RBI was acting as a facilitator of the financial sectors. Right, it was not regulating per se, but it was facilitating the private banks, the foreign banks, to establish their presence in India. Right, without consulting the RBI, they can take many of the measures, many of the decisions. Right. So this was the financial sector reform that was taken up by the government of India. The what actually has happened is that these reform policies led to the establishment private sector banks and as well as foreign sector banks that we have already discussed, right? And they were also free, they were also having freeness to open new branches without the approval of RBI, right? So that doesn't matter, the decision of a foreign bank to establish the branch either in Mumbai or Delhi or Bangalore or any other place, that was the decision of the private bank, right? RBI was not having those powers of decision making now, right? So in that sense, the liberalization was done in the financial sector. So what actually has happened is that foreign institutional investors, those big investors, FIIs, they such as merchant bankers, mutual funds, pension funds, were now allowed to invest in Indian financial markets, right? So those foreign investment which was banned before LPG reforms was now allowed to invest in India, right? Now, next reform that was taken up in those financial sector was tax reforms, right? Before 1990s, the personal income tax was as high as 60 to 70%. Right. So 60 to 70% was the tax paid by an average Indian to the government, and the rest 30-40% was to be kept by him. So that was the condition before 1990s, right? Before the LPG reforms. So in the reforms in the tax domain was also taken up by the government in 1991, and those were called as fiscal policy reforms. So we already know that tax is divided into two parts, that is direct taxes and indirect taxes. In the direct taxes, all those taxes that was paid by the individuals or the corporations, that is businesses, is called direct taxes. And there has been continuously those reduction in the tax rates have been continuous from the 1991. And as I have already told you, before 1991, 60 to 70% was the income tax on an individual income, right? And now it has been reduced to 10 to 30% based on the income. Uh, it is approximately from varies from 10 to 30%. So this was done, this reform was done at that point of the time, right? So continuously tax rates were reduced on the individual as well as corporations. So moderate rate of income tax encourage savings and voluntary disclosure of income. So पहले क्या होता था कि savings नहीं करते थे लोग, because whatever the income was going on with the of the individual, तो लोग कैश में ज्यादा डील करते थे, right? तो कैश से they were hiding their income, फ्रॉम द गवर्नमेंट। तो गवर्नमेंट से जो इनकम का जो इनकम जो टैक्स आता था, दैट वाज वेरी लो, राइट? सो व्हेन द टैक्स रेट रिड्यूस्ड, दो पीपल वर voluntarily disclosing their income and paying their taxes now. Now what actually has happened is that tax revenues from the tax increased exponentially, right? Corporate tax, which was very high, has also been reduced. Right now, corporation tax is approximately 22%, approximately. Right now, we have seen these reforms in the direct taxation. In the indirect taxation also, reforms were taken up, and those taxes which are put on goods and services, or are called as the indirect taxes. Right now, what was the reforms that were done in the indirect taxes? GST reform is one of the important reform that has been taken up in the indirect taxes domain, right? Another important thing is the simplification of taxation to increase the compliance of the taxpayers, and it was to increase the simplification of the tax, right? So GST, in that sense, has simplified the procedures of taxation, the indirect taxation, right, in India. Now, moving to the next sector, it is foreign exchange reforms. So, not only the taxation, foreign exchange reforms were also implemented by the government of India. In 1991, the rupee was devalued again. Right, so it was second time that devaluation of Indian rupee was done. Right, against the foreign currency, and it was done in order to increase the export from India. Right, तो हमने अपने पैसे की जो वैल्यू है वो घटा दी थी, जिससे कि हमारा जो exports those can rise, right? So foreign exchange का इनफ्लो बढ़ने लगा, एंड आर एक्सपोर्ट्स ऑल्सो इंक्रीज। तो एक्सपोर्ट से जो पैसे आते थे, दोज वर ऑल्सो गोइंग टू फॉरेन एक्सचेंज। सो फ्री डिटर्मिनेशन ऑफ रूपी वैल्यू वाज ऑल्सो डन बिफोर 1991। RBI was managing the rupee exchange rate, right? So that was called as managed rupee, right? And now what actually was happening after 1991, this rupee, right, foreign exchange rate of the rupee was market determined. Now it was now market determined, right? So markets now also the markets determine the exchange rates based on the demand and supply of the rupee in Indian market, in Indian or international market, right? Now, next reform that was taken in the liberalization sector was trade and investment policy reforms were also taken up. Right, liberalization of trade and investment regime was initial to increase the international competitiveness of the Indian economy. Right, and foreign investment technology was also coming into the India now. Right, so in that sense, the trade and investment was liberalized. Trade policy reforms, what was the aim of those trade policy reforms? It was for the dismantling of the competitiveness, quantitative restrictions on the imports and exports that we have already discussed. कि पहले quota system था, and also there was the quantity that was fixed by the government, right? Or even जो taxes थे, import taxes were put, right? तो उनको उन quantitative जो quotas थे, those were रिड्यूस्ड, ठीक है? तो उन रेस्ट्रिक्शंस को हटा दिया गया था। रिडक्शन इन द टैरिफ रेट्स, ठीक है? तो टैरिफ रेट्स में भी रिडक्शन हुआ था, एंड रिमूवल ऑफ द लाइसेंसिंग प्रोसीजर फॉर इंपोर्ट्स, इवन फॉर द इंपोर्ट्स वट एवर द लाइसेंसेस वर नीडेड, दोज ऑल्सो वर रिड्यूस्ड, ठीक है? तो इन दैट सेंस सारे ही सेक्टर्स में लिबरलाइजेशन का इम्पैक्ट देखने को मिला था। इंपोर्ट लाइसेंसिंग वाज एबोलिश्ड एक्सेप्ट सम केसेस, जो कि हजार्डियस केमिकल्स, इन्वायरमेंट सेंसिटिव इंडस्ट्रीज के केमिकल्स एक्सेट्रा होते हैं, उनके लिए लाइसेंसेस रखा गया था। अदरवाइज दोज इंपोर्ट लाइसेंसेस वर एबोलिश्ड। Export duties also reduced in order to increase the export of Indian goods. तो उसको increase करने के लिए export duties were also reduced. ठीक है? So this was done in order to increase the exports from India, right? Okay, so this was the thing for the liberalization. Now moving to the next reform that was taken up, that is privatization. And what the privatization means is, privatization means if we are allowing the holdings of the private sector, or we are transferring the ownership of the public sector undertakings or PSUs to the private sector, that process is called privatization. Okay, so shedding of the ownership, either ownership or management of the government owned enterprises to the private sector is called privatization. And it was done by the two ways, either by withdrawing the government from the ownership, right, or outrighting the sale of the whole PSUs, right? So in that sense, what can be done in order to privatize? Suppose this is PSU, right? So if two ways the privatization can be achieved: either you sell the whole PSU, right, and government exits from the PSU management, right, or PSU can be managed, management or finances, right, financial decisions of those PSUs can be given to the private sector, which can manage well, and government limits itself into another domain, right? So these are the two methods through which the privatization of a company can happen, right? So so privatization of the public sector company, there may be another method by selling of equity of PSUs or to the public, is known as disinvestment. So this investment was also done. Means you have invested, the government has invested. Now it is taking some part, right? It is not taking a whole part. Some part of its investment is government is taking back. Right. So it is disinvesting some part from that PSU, and that other those part is being sold to the public, right? So this is also a method to reduce the government's stake in PSU sector. These reforms were taken in order to improve the financial decision, facilitate the modernization in the PSUs, right? So because of the government intervention, the PSUs were not taking up new industries, they were not investing in new technology, and they were not improving their operational operations, right? But when the government took a exit route, right, so they were free. The PSUs were free to take their own decisions, right, to bring up the new technology into the management, right? So this was done, and private capital and managerial capabilities now were taken up, right, by the utilized by the effectively utilized by the PSUs, right? So in that sense, what actually was happening is the so in order to increase the managing power of the finance, the PSUs, what government did is that government started to give those industries, those PSUs, a category, right? So what categories were determined by the government? Those PSUs were divided into three categories, right? Maharatna, Navratna, and Maniratna. So why this division was done? In order to infuse the efficiency and professionalism, right? So so that those PSUs can come up and increase their competitiveness in the global economy, right? So those decision making powers, right, so managing powers, decision making, financial powers were given by the government of India to those PSU sector, right, PSU companies, right? So what was actually happening is that government has decided that okay, those PSUs will remain with the government, but decision making power will be slowly given to them, right? Government will not micromanage every PSU, right? So those PSUs can go into the market, they can raise their own resources, and they can increase their operations by their own. So this was all that was done in the PSU space, right? Now, what actually was happening is that government thought that the privatization could provide them impetus to flow into the inflow of the FDI, right? Government has also made attempts to improve the efficiency of PSUs. So PSU की efficiency कैसे manage की गई? We have already discussed in the box that we have discussed just now, by giving them the autonomy, right? So by transferring them decision making power, financial power, right? So if a person is there in within the PSU, right? If a managing director is there, he better knows where the company should invest as compared to the government, right? So उसको the power of those finances as well as decision making in respect of finances as well as operational autonomy was given to those PSU heads. And that is why those PSUs were categorized into Maharatna, Navratna, and Maniratna, right? So based on that only, these powers were given to them, right? So this is how the privatization was achieved in the PSU sector, right? Okay, so this was all about this chapter, and this is the part one. We will be discussing this globalization in our next class. And till that point of the time, please revise these concepts. Please revise those chapter one and chapter two that we have already done, right? So that everything gets clear. That what was the history of Indian economy, and those history will lead you to know what are the if what are the programs or the policies of the government of India that is going on right now, right? So that you can know that what will be the effect of these policies in the time to come on the Indian economy, right? So that is what is needed. Okay, meet you again in the next lecture and part second of this chapter, right? Until that point of the time, keep reading, right? Thank you.